seated. How many of you remember the movie Shrek? Right. Sort of a modern classic of sorts, an upside-down fairy tale featuring an ogre anti-hero voiced by Mike Myers. One of the things that makes the film so memorable is Eddie Murphy's turn as the talking donkey, creatively named Donkey. Of course, the generation of kids that fell in love with Donkey probably weren't aware of the role that made so many of us older folks fall in love with Eddie Murphy in the first place. That would be Beverly Hills Cop, I think. Did you know that 2 weeks before production, someone else was slated to play the lead in Beverly Hills Cop? Any guesses on who it was? Sylvester Stallone. I know, right? Can you imagine the role of Axel Foley being played by Sly Stallone, like Rocky Balboa running around LA with like the, dun 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 dun, and it's like Rocky. Very different movie, probably a pretty bad movie, so glad it worked out the way it did. Anyway, if only there were a Torah portion that was more analogous to Beverly Hills Cop, I could talk more about that movie, but instead, we'll have to stick with the talking donkey. Because that's exactly what happens in Parashat Balak. And we often focus our attention on Bilam and curses turned blessings, or the words of Matovu that I mentioned earlier, which proclaim each morning, first thing when we walk into shul, and rightly so, but the talking donkey is also worth considering in her own right. This donkey is female, an aton, not a chamor, so Eddie Murphy probably would not have been right for the role, but lest we think this is where the similarities end, I think it's hard to miss the humor that's embedded in the actual story in Torah. Balak ben Zippor, who is king of the Moabites, comes to Bilam and asks that he damn the Jewish people. Now, Bilam is particularly effective, it seems, at blessings and curses, so this is no small matter. At first, Bilam refuses, since God tells him that these Israelites are not to be cursed. And then Balak sweetens the deal, and Bilam decides to go ahead with it, making clear to his benefactor that his power comes from God, Yud-He Vav-He no less, a strange thing for a Mesopotamian non-Jew to say. And at first we think, all right, this guy is just gaming the system. He'll take the money and do what God wants, and all is square. And once Bilam gets going, the story gets even more fantastical. A malach, an angel or messenger of God, appears in the road to block the path of Bilam and his donkey. God, it appears, is really still not okay with this whole thing, but Bilam is determined, so he beats the donkey until she continues. The donkey sees the angel. Bilam, this wise and gifted soothsayer, does not. Funny, right? It's like that other movie, Field of Dreams, where Kevin Costner's family can all see the ball players, but nobody else can. 3 times this happens. The donkey sees the angel, Bilam does not see the angel, Bilam beats the she-ass, and that's when it gets even sillier. The donkey speaks. "What have I done to you that you have beaten me these 3 times?" she exclaims. Now, I don't know about you, but if a donkey started talking to me, I could imagine reacting in a number of different ways. I might wonder if I'm a little dehydrated. I might question my own sanity, but Bilam just responds to the talking donkey as if he's Shrek and it's perfectly normal for donkeys to talk to ogres. "You have made a mockery of me. If I had a sword with me, I would kill you." But the donkey is also not fazed in the slightest by this. and has a pretty good reply. Look, I am the ass that you've been riding all along until this very day. Have I been in the habit of doing thus to you? I'm a good donkey. I'm a capable beast of burden. I know how to carry a person. I know how to walk in a straight line. Do you think I would keep messing this up if I had a choice? Bilam looks at the donkey and with one word, lo, admits that maybe the donkey has a point. Okay, it's not Beverly Hills Cop, but funny, right? I think it's funny. Look, the Torah is clear that this is odd. Many world cultures have oral traditions replete with talking animals. Those animals often have wisdom and self-awareness lacking in their human counterparts. But we're not big on talking animals in our tradition, are we? The Bible has two that I can think of. What's the other one? Right, the serpent, the snake, and the Garden of Eden. When something is that rare, we should pay attention, and Bilam finally does pay attention. The next verse explains, then God, Yud-He-Vav-He, uncovered Bilam's eyes, and he saw the angel of God standing in the way, his drawn sword in his hand. Thereupon he bowed right down to his nostrils. The tale is silly, but it's serious too. Bilam's mission is sinister, perhaps even genocidal, if you take his intention to its logical conclusion. But that's often when humor presents itself in the Bible and elsewhere. The same is true with the terrifying and farcical tale of Haman, Esther, Mordecai, and Ahasuerus. And while this story can certainly be read as symbolism for how to confront evil, there are other equally important lessons to be found. One question for our sages is the capacity of animals to see or sense that which we cannot. Rashi and Ramban, Nachmanides, disagree on this point. According to Rashi, Shenatan HaKadosh Baruch Hu Reshut Labhema Lirot Yoter Min Ha'adam. Animals are given the capacity to see more than humans. Humans, it seems, would be overwhelmed by all the wild and scary things lurking beyond our field of view. If you think this is untrue, consider how some of us closely await details on the latest strain of the coronavirus, and how many more are decidedly incurious about this. Ramban, though, questions Rashi's assumption here, that animals are somehow more enlightened than humans. Therefore, he writes, you could explain the phrase, and the ass saw the angel of the eternal, to mean that she felt the presence of something which frightened her off. Animals get spooked. Anyone who knows prey animals certainly knows this is the case. We have bunnies at my house. They're adorable. But even though they know us pretty well at this point, even though we feed them every day and make sure that they have all they need, they still jump away when you move too quickly to pick them up. They know that at any moment, anything bigger could come and eat them. Good thing we keep kosher. I'll spare you another movie reference at this point. So Ramban thinks the donkey's reaction isn't about seeing the angel per se, but sensing something is off, something is there, like forest animals scattering before an approaching storm. And that's what I want to consider with you for a moment longer, the questions of perception and choice. Because clearly Bilam is just clueless. Here is an obstacle in his path. The donkey reacts. The man atop the donkey plods forward. What do we do with obstacles in our path? Think about your life. I'm sure that each of us can think of numerous times we've encountered obstacles along our way. How do we navigate them? How often do we veer to one side or the other when we should proceed forward? When do we insist on moving forward quickly when we ought to take our time and negotiate a particular challenge? When should we stop and think instead of acting at all? When should we just turn around? In other words, the story of Bilam and the talking donkey is a story about free will, about choice. Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler, the great 20th century teacher of Musar, speaks not only of bechira, choice, but of nikudot bechirot, of choice points. These choice points lie somewhere between reality and the false stories that we tell ourselves. Consider a vice of yours. I won't ask you to name it out loud. Most of us have them, though. Maybe it's food, or it's smoking, or it's shopping. Maybe it's too much of a good thing, like exercise. Maybe it's unchecked time on social media, or that third drink at a bar. Yes, there are obstacles in our path which are beyond our control entirely, that each of us must contend with. But how often are those obstacles also of our own making? How does self-sabotage factor into our questions of free will and choice? Rabbi Dessler writes, choice takes place at that point where truth, as the person sees it, confronts the illusion produced in him by the power of falsehood. The location of the specific choice point may change based on the day, the circumstances, our own sense of self in that moment. And when we habituate to bad choices, they become easier to make. The paradox is that the more that we make choices that are unhealthy or even destructive to ourselves or to others, the more we whittle away at our capacity to make those choices. The good news is that the same is true for positive choices. When we come to a choice point and we choose to do good or right, the next positive choice becomes more available to us, more achievable. Goodness begets goodness. And that's the great tragedy of Bil'am, why he's called Bil'am Harasha, Bil'am the wicked, by our rabbinic tradition, because the story of Bil'am and the donkey is a story of free will and choice dressed up as a story about fate. Bil'am relinquishes his responsibility from the get-go. He insists he can only say or do what God allows him to say or do. So when the time comes for him to choose not to go, not to curse, not to accept payment, not to beat the donkey for her lack of obedience, at every moment he at least acts as if he's being acted upon. The donkey, too, is acted upon. That's why the Torah doesn't say that the donkey opens her mouth and speaks. It says, Vayiftach Hashem et pi ha'atan. God opens the mouth of the donkey. Donkeys don't talk, silly, the Torah seems to be saying. Pirkei Avot, the Mishnah, even goes so far as to suggest the mouth of the talking donkey was one of the 10 things created ben hashmashot, that is, between the suns at dusk on the very last day of creation. That donkey mouth was waiting around for us, like Eddie Murphy just waiting around for Sly Stallone to pull out of Beverly Hills Cop. Eddie Murphy, though, is a comic genius. The donkey is a foil. Bil'am is a human who thinks he's an automaton. We are not. We ought to know better. We must choose to recognize the obstacles before us when they're sinister, when they have the potential to knock us down, and also when they might build us or others up. And more than this, we must have the ability to ask whether the path that we're on is the right path at all. Bil'am was never meant to go down that road. It was a treacherous road. God said, don't do it. And he did it anyway. And then threw up his hands and said, I'm not in charge. That's cowardice of the highest order. This Shabbat, may we strive to do better. May we recognize the paths we should take and also the ones that we should not. And when we find ourselves on the wrong path, may we have the courage to choose differently. Shabbat Shalom.